we have an opportunity to have a little more conversation about General Convention, how it works, what questions you have. So glad to be with you this morning. This week we'll talk about General Convention, which is for the Episcopal Church, and then next week we'll talk about the Lambeth Conference, which is the entire Anglican Communion. It functions a little differently, its role is different, and of course it's much larger. So we'll talk about both of those in succession, but first it's helpful to know a little bit about the Episcopal Church, our own church, and how it's governed. So first I have, I have a slide that compares the U.S. government and the Episcopal Church. This is a sort of loose analogy, but it does help us get on the same page, speaking the same language of things. It's not a literal translation, but can be sort of helpful for thinking about these things. First, the nation is the Episcopal Church. I'll name a couple of times as we're here this morning that the Episcopal Church is not just the United States. Often we say the national church, but really it's bigger than that. So the Episcopal Church is the overarching entity, with the president being the presiding bishop, Bishop Michael Curry. Congress is the General Convention. General Convention governs all of the Episcopal Church. The House of Bishops and House of Deputies are the two-house system for running the church. We might think of the diocese as a state. Sometimes a diocese encompasses a whole state. Sometimes it's half of a state. In the case of Texas, it's a few dioceses. So again, not a one-to-one there, but a diocese is a sort of smaller region. With a bishop leading the diocese, diocesan convention is the body that governs the diocese, and then we have the congregation, the congregational level, which is led by the rector or vicar or missioner and its vestry. And then I'm a very visual person, so this is another way to look at our system. We have 9 provinces. I'll show you a map of that in a moment. And within each province, there's multiple dioceses. And so the way that it's written within the province, you would assume that there would be lots of those red diocesan bubbles. But it would get really confusing to try and fill all of that in on this graphic. So that's kind of big picture. How is the Episcopal Church structured? Do you have any questions about that so far? All the different pieces. The rector. Yeah, you're welcome. $114 in the Episcopal Church. So the Episcopal Church is not just in the United States. Primarily, it's the United States, but we have a couple other dioceses. It's somewhere around 100. Yeah, so here's a map of all the provinces and the dioceses. So you'll see, it's hard to see up there. I meant to get it on your handouts. But there are states that are divided into a couple of different dioceses. We also have Province 9, which includes Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Honduras, Puerto Rico, and Venezuela. Taiwan is its own province and diocese. We also have the Convocation of Episcopal Churches in Europe, in Haiti, and the Virgin Islands. So that's how you end up with around 100, not just 50. I grew up in Diocese of Atlanta, which is the north half of Georgia. Diocese of Georgia is the southern half of Georgia. So sometimes the names of the dioceses can get a little confusing if you don't know who else is around you. You might assume Diocese of Georgia is the whole state. It's not. So some of that is sort of confusing if you only know it by name. But I find myself looking at maps like this often to remember where different people are and how different states are broken up. Any questions about the provinces, dioceses, sort of map of the Episcopal Church? Okay. This is easily Googleable if you have any interest in looking at it in detail and sorting through who's where and that kind of stuff. It can be sort of interesting, but also can get a little confusing. But you're welcome to Google it. Most of the information I have is pretty easy to find online. So the big picture of what General Convention is the governing body for the Episcopal Church. It meets every 3 years to approve budgets, programs, and canonical changes. The canons are a sort of law for the church. And the Executive Council carries out the work of General Convention between its gatherings. So generally, decisions that are made for the full body of the Episcopal Church are made at General Convention or by the Executive Council if decisions need to be made between those 3-year gatherings, or every 3-year gatherings. The structure of General Convention is made up of 2 houses. There's the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies. The House of Bishops is all active and retired bishops. So even after a bishop retires, they can be part of that body and have voice and vote in that body. They meet at General Convention and also meet twice a year between conventions. There's about 300 members of that house. The House of Deputies is made up of 4 clergy people and 4 lay people from each diocese, 2 youth from each province, and the president is elected by the House. The president of the House of Deputies is elected by the House of Deputies. And there's about 900 members there. So you can see how when you have a little over 100 dioceses times 8 people, plus those youth, you end up with a lot of people trying to be in the same room and have conversations about some really big topics. So the procedure of how they have those conversations is really important when you think about that many people. When people talk about the character of each of these houses, the House of Bishops is normally much more collegial and relaxed. These are people who spend a fair amount of time together, and it's much easier to organize a meeting of 300 people than it is 900 people. 300 is still big, but there are folks that have had other meetings together throughout the year, have some pre-existing relationships, and are able to have some of those the table talk that is sort of hard in the House of Deputies with that many people who, many of them have not met before. Even within the same diocese, you might not have built a relationship with other folks who are coming from the same place as you, just depending on your relationship with the diocese. Any questions about that much? I just want to go slow to make sure that we understand each component of how all of this works. The presiding bishop presides over the House of Bishops. He's the lead bishop, if you will. The presiding bishop, their job is to be the chief pastor to the Episcopal Church. They're also a primate, which is sort of funny for us linguistically, but that means that he's a representative to the Anglican Communion and a spokesperson for the Episcopal Church. So the canons name, again, canons, those laws for the church, name that the responsibility of the presiding bishop is a responsibility for giving leadership in initiating and developing policy and strategy of the church, to speak God's word to the church and to the world, and act as the chief representative of the church in its corporate capacity. So a big job. The presiding bishop is elected to a 9-year term, so that's 3 general conventions. And next general convention, we will be electing a new presiding bishop. It's already been almost 9 years with Bishop Curry. He was elected in 2015. Am I doing my math right? Yes, 2015. Any questions about the role of the presiding bishop? We often hear Bishop Curry, his name sort of tossed around, but we don't always understand exactly what he does day to day, but he travels around between dioceses, does lots of speaking and preaching engagements, lots of meetings. I would hate to see his calendar. I can just imagine how overwhelming it is to log into his Google Calendar and see all of the meetings and Zooms and travel and all of that. It's a really big job. So it's important that we elect someone who is up to the task. And I'm excited to see our slate for the next presiding bishop. The president of the House of Deputies presides over that meeting, over the House of Deputies. There's also a treasurer, secretary, parliamentarian, someone who makes sure that we follow all of the rules of order. Again, with a body of 900 people, it's important that you have at least one person who's making sure that we're following procedure, just to make sure that you can get through all of the material that is asked of them in General Convention. So at this past convention, just a few weeks ago, we elected a new president and vice president of the House of Deputies. These are both significant elections. Julia Ayala Harris is the first Latina woman to serve in this role and the first woman of color to serve in this role. And Rachel Tabor Hamilton is Native American, so also a significant piece as we think about racial relations in the Episcopal Church and the work that we are doing around truth-telling in those relationships. Both of these are 3-year terms, so they begin at the close of the General Convention in which they are elected, and they are able to be reelected for 3 terms, so a total of 9 years. Questions about any of those leaders of the different houses? Yeah. I'm going to bring you the microphone just so anyone online can hear you.
Is the presiding bishop able to be reelected?
No.
Only 9 years?
The presiding bishop can only serve 1 term. Mm-hmm.
These newly elected president and vice president of the House of Deputies, do they only serve a 2-year term, since we only have 2 years to the next General Convention?
I guess technically, since this year's General Convention was actually a year delayed, that may affect the length of their term. Pretty often they're reelected at the next General Convention, but it could mean that they only get to serve 8 years instead of 9. This year's General Convention was actually supposed to be last summer, so our next General Convention to stay on schedule will be in 24 rather than 25. So it's a good question. I'm sure there are people who have talked about exactly that and maybe written in some rules, just since that's a change because of COVID.
I just want to know more about what Samantha Clare did at this convention,
Yeah.
since she represented
Yes.
us.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about that as we talk about the different roles in General Convention, but good question. Yeah, Samantha Clare went to General Convention as one of the delegates from Diocese of Arkansas. So really she would be the expert on a lot of what just happened at General Convention. She's enjoying some vacation, but I'm sure would be glad to hear your questions about her experience of that gathering when she returns. So she was part of the House of Deputies, one of those 4 lay people sent by the Diocese of Arkansas, and was accompanied by 4 clergy from the Diocese of Arkansas. I want to be really clear that the clergy can be deacons or priests. Sometimes we assume when we say you're sending 4 clergy that it's 4 priests, but deacons are also part of that order. So you could end up with a combination of folks there. So Samantha was part of that body of about 900 people making decisions on resolutions for the House of Deputies. So she can tell you more specifics of the conversations that took place. both on and offline, the side conversations too. The process for legislation at General Convention is, again, much like government, but a resolution is submitted and assigned to a committee in the House of Initial Action. So a resolution can start either in the House of Bishops or in the House of Deputies, depending on how the presiding bishop and president and vice president of the House of Deputies decide where the best place for it to start is, and a committee is assigned to that. A committee reviews that resolution and offers a public hearing. They have to, in the context of a normal General Convention, these legislative hearings happen during the course of those couple of weeks that General Convention is gathered. This year looked really different because they did a lot of those hearings ahead of time, so it was harder to know that they were happening. But generally, it has to be announced at least 4 hours ahead of the hearing. Again, that timeline works a little better when you're all in person at a convention center. But those resolutions will have a public hearing for conversation. Amendments might come up in those conversations. Debate might come up there in committee. And then the committee gives a recommendation to the House. So if the House of Initial Action is the House of Deputies, the committee gives a recommendation to the House of Deputies. And those possible recommendations are either that the resolution be adopted but amended, that the resolution be rejected to a committee, commission, agency, or board, or that it be discharged, meaning there's no further action to be taken. And then it's assigned to the next day's schedule, either for debate or on a consent calendar. And then if it's adopted in that first house, the House of Initial Action, the process repeats in the second house, and it only becomes an act of General Convention if both houses adopt it in identical language. So that's significant when there is amended language, particularly if the second house that looks at something amends it, then it has to go back. So, I mean, you could play a sort of game of tennis with some of these. It's not common that it goes back and forth that much, but it is perfectly possible, and they have to agree on the same language. Questions about that? It's important to know what these resolutions are even about. What are we talking about? What's at stake in these? So often it's to take a specific action that might be passing a budget. It can also direct or encourage a diocese, congregations, provinces, or members to do particular things or to not do particular things. They'll also say those things that particularly clergy are not allowed to do, or churches are not allowed to do. Things you would assume, I mean, like poor behavior kind of things. They offer appreciation. Often there'll be a whole list of people that they want to just adopt a moment of praise for those folks who have given significant service to the church or to the world. They will encourage government and non-church entities to take a specific action. So often a resolution will come forward that has something to do with our Office of Government Relations. The Episcopal Church has an Office of Government Relations in which that resolution will say, we want to encourage government officials to do XYZ thing. And with that, often there's statements of the church's positions on social issues. Questions about that list of things? I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the significant things that came through just recently at General Convention. But the things that are often really interesting to folks are the social issues. So there have been things recently, the Episcopal Church making statements about racial reconciliation, particularly as it relates to us as the Episcopal Church, and also as it relates to government and laws. There have been things about care for creation. There have been encouragements around incarceration and decarceration, prison reform, those sorts of things. There's lots of talk about the prayer book. There's always lots of talk about the prayer book. It's been a while since we have updated it. So that's a constant topic of conversation and likely will be for a while. We'll keep hearing about that. But yeah, I'll give a list of some of the significant things that just happened. Other questions so far? We'll shift to the significant news from General Convention 80. This was the 80th gathering of General Convention for the Episcopal Church. One of those significant pieces, like I mentioned, is the election of the President and Vice President of the House of Deputies. There was much conversation about liturgical resources and the prayer book. Lots of resources are approved for trial use at General Conventions. So once something is written, then it has to be agreed upon as something that is a permissible liturgical resource. So General Convention approves those things to be tried out by different dioceses and churches before they become eventually, potentially, a prayer book revision. But that trial period allows us to sort of work out some of the issues with those liturgical resources before we print a new prayer book, and then, end up printing lots of revisions of the book. It's really significant for us to revise the prayer book, so we want to make sure that we have it right before we put something into that book and purchase a zillion copies to go all over the church. But that's a way to sort of decide what things are worthy of putting in the prayer book. Where did I put the microphone? Yeah, give us
Back and
steps.
forth. So when you say the prayer book revision, is that the Book of Common Prayers that they're revising?
Yes, the Book of Common Prayer. There is a thing called the Book of Occasional Services that has services that we don't use as often. So we would have a textbook-sized Book of Common Prayer if all of those things were printed. So sometimes those are liturgies for particular saints or occasions, particular life events that are sort of set apart so that we don't all have to carry around a huge prayer book. Some of the things that are significant as we try on these liturgical resources and think about prayer book revision is gendered language for God. There are questions about what marriage resources are available in the prayer book. Those sorts of things have become really significant in the conversation around prayer book revision. A resolution was adopted to create goals for net carbon neutrality by 2030. So that's a goal. They're not saying we officially will make that happen. But there are concrete steps attached to that in the resolution. Significant for the church to say that that's something that's a value for us as a whole body. There are a couple of resolutions around truth-telling and healing, particularly as it relates to our role in the history of Indigenous boarding schools. And all of the harm that happened through those schools. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the boarding schools where Native Americans were sent and had their culture basically stripped of them. Yeah, those are the Indigenous boarding schools. We did. Yeah. Yeah. So that's exactly why that resolution matters, is that so we can name our role in that history. I don't know specifics of that role other than to name we did have a part in that. The Episcopal Church did a lot of mission work among Indigenous people. Sadly, that mission work had a real colonizing effect So part of the language of truth-telling is to name that there is a story that needs to be told, so that we can all know about our role in it, and then work to make amends. It's hard to make amends if we don't know what we're apologizing for.
Wasn't the government assigned specific churches to different tribes, as I remember being told?
I believe so.
And we were assigned the Sioux tribes, and still, several years ago, we had quite a few people go and work with that area.
Yeah, I know we have a historic relationship with Navajo land. There's a diocese for Navajo lands. But yeah, people were... Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I did not know that bit of history, that we have a particular connection with the Sioux people. But yeah, people were basically assigned a church that they were supposed to subscribe to, which we can look at and say that's really problematic now, and that's part of the healing efforts that we ought to take part in. They've switched a lot of language around racial healing from racial reconciliation to truth-telling, again, to name that there's a story that needs to be told first, but it's not on the next slide. But just to name that there's been a shift in language to acknowledge that we do have to tell the story before we just give a blanket apology and assume that we will be forgiven. So truth-telling has become a lot of that language, which is significant. Our language does really matter around those things. There was a resolution that required action in response to the Episcopal Church's racial audit. A racial audit was done of the full church just a few years ago. So this resolution is saying we do need to respond to that information, not just collect it. So in particular, I imagine some response will be having more conversations about racism, doing more anti-racism trainings, being really careful about making sure ordination is equally accessible to all people, things like that. But we put a lot of resources into this racial audit, so it's important that we respond to it accordingly. There's a resolution to create a task force on LGBTQ inclusion. Often deputies who are going to General Convention will create what we call caucuses. So they'll gather people who have a similar... Microphone got flipped. Thank you, Dan. Often people will create caucuses, so a gathering of people who may have some similar goals for the church, and then they'll submit a resolution. And that is where this task force for LGBTQ inclusion came from. There was an LGBTQ caucus for this past General Convention, and they suggested some things like that. A resolution to reunite the Diocese of North Texas and Diocese of Texas. I've got a typo there, sorry about that. So Diocese of North Texas, Fort Worth is there, and there, over the past several years, there's been a lot of conflict for the churches in Fort Worth, particularly as it relates to gay marriage is one of the big issues there. Ordination of women is sort of tricky in that area. But those churches that still identify as Episcopalian that were in the Diocese of North Texas have now been reunited with the Diocese of Texas, which makes the geographic boundaries of the Diocese of Texas even more confusing than it was before. It sort of stretches diagonally across the state. Kind of strange, and because of the size of that diocese, they have a couple of bishops, suffragan bishops or assisting bishops, throughout the diocese to help govern it. Well, that's a really significant reunion there, and really creates a lot of resources for those churches that were the Diocese of North Texas. Because of some fracturing that happened several years ago, many of those churches were left without resources and good leadership. So that, I think, is going to be a really positive shift, and one that people in both sides of that are really excited about. There is a trial use for an alternate liturgy for Good Friday. The Good Friday liturgy uses the Passion narrative from the Gospel of John. John uses a lot of anti-Jewish language throughout his gospel, and that's something that we are realizing has had some significant effects on Jewish people. So there's an alternate liturgy that uses, the primary change is that it uses a different Passion narrative that does not include that harmful language. The sort of language that has meant people have come to a Good Friday service and then later in the day thought it would be a good idea to inflict harm on Jewish people. I mean, that's what's at stake when we use a Passion narrative that is so anti-Jewish, that people hear a message in church that is not actually what we're trying to convey. So that is really significant. One of my seminary professors had a big role in creating that liturgy. So on a personal note, I'm really excited that his work is being recognized in that way, but also on a larger church note, it matters that we use language that actually communicates the things that we want and puts those things out into the world. So that's a big one. There has been lots of talk about calendar revision. Again, one of those resources that doesn't get updated very often, our calendar of saints and feast days. There have been a lot of folks that people really want added to those calendars, people who have lived more recently, but had a significant role in the church. I found it really interesting when I was looking through these. There also was a recommendation to remove someone from the calendar. So William Porcher DuBose was a really well-regarded Episcopal priest, but also was a member of the Confederacy and owned numerous slaves. So now people look at his legacy and realize perhaps this isn't something for us to be celebrating. So it is conditionally approved that he be removed from that calendar of observations. But I thought that was really fascinating when I was reading through these. There's a DuBose Center in Monteagle, Tennessee, right near Swanee, a really significant camp and conference center in that area. So this is a big deal that to have these conversations about removing him from our observation of saints. And I am curious to see some of the ripple effects of that, if any. But revising that calendar is another significant change, like the prayer book. Perhaps not as weighty as shifting the prayer book is, but many Episcopalians take great stock in the saints that we choose to recognize. Questions about some of that news from the most recent General Convention. Again, I wasn't there. I was supposed to be there. Sad that I wasn't there. I was part of the Young Adult Festival planning team, and the Young Adult Festival is a gathering that happens sort of adjacent to General Convention, a gathering of young adults, sort of in their own conference of sorts, but then also having an opportunity to engage with General Convention, go to hearings, hear some of the debate around particular things, and take part in conversation. But this year for General Convention, it was really stripped bare bones. So any presence that was non-essential, which was the Young Adult Festival, people who were just extras, not delegates to General Convention, and the General Convention was reduced in time significantly. So what is normally a 2-week gathering became 4 or 5 days, which implies the long hours that they were in meetings. So God bless Samantha Clare and her compatriots in that effort. It was some really long days of meetings for them. And these sort of debates and voting can be really tedious. So that's a big shift to have to condense it in that way. But anyway, I was supposed to be there, and they had to shift some things. I hope to be there next time. But Samantha will have some of the in and outs that I don't have. I have the information that's been published. But her in-person experience is significant. Questions about any of that? Yeah. Yeah, the question is about the relationship between the Episcopal Church here and with the Anglican Church in England. Mostly we'll talk about that next week when we talk about the Lambeth Conference. That's the place where we really see that relationship show up. Particularly the Archbishop of Canterbury hosts that gathering, and he's our primary tie to the church in England. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. It's a good question. There's a lot to unpack there. Yeah. Yes, yeah. Yeah, Michael Curry doing the royal wedding where the Episcopal Church gained some fame. So the General Convention is more than just meetings. This time around, it was mostly meetings because of the way they had to condense it and restrict the number of people who were there. Still around 1,000 attendees, so a big gathering, but normally it's more like 5,000 because of the people who just want to be there. So this time around, it was legislative sessions and those committee meetings. But normally there's also Young Adult Festival, a huge exhibit hall with lots of different, the seminaries go, Episcopal ministries go, people who sell vestments, all sorts of stuff in that exhibit hall. People who just go to observe or volunteer. There's informal gatherings, networking opportunities, all sorts of stuff that normally happens in conjunction with General Convention. Between conventions, this is where the Executive Council pops up. So the Executive Council is made up of 40 members total who meet twice a year. So there's 20 members who are elected by General Convention for a 6-year term. 4 of those are bishops, 4 of those are other clergy, and 12 are laity. There's 18 members that are made up of one bishop or priest and 1 layperson from each province. So 9 provinces times 2. And then the presiding bishop is the chair of that council, and the president of the House of Deputies is the vice chair. There's also secretary and treasurer for that. And they have various committees that they split out into and have conversations about governance of the church, our finances, mission within and beyond the Episcopal Church. And they gather twice a year to make some of those decisions between General Convention gatherings. Samantha Clare is also on Executive Council for Province 7. So really great that we have someone who can give voice to some of the things we're talking about here in Arkansas. Next week, we will talk about Lambeth, which is, again, the global gathering of the Anglican Communion. So that'll touch on some of our relationships with Anglican churches in other areas. Any questions about General Convention before we close today? They do decide in advance, several years in advance. So next General Convention in 2024 will be in Louisville, Kentucky. Mm-hmm.
I noticed that the resolutions had like A, B, C, D, and a number. I was wondering if there's a significance to
There
that.
is. So the letter coding relates to who sent it in. Was it an individual? Was it a diocese? Was it a particular committee? The key is somewhere on the Episcopal Church website. I don't remember what each of the things are. But you'll notice there, if you look through, there's 22 pages of resolutions, and that's just the list of titles, not clicking in to see information about them. So if you want to look at that, you can. It's at generalconvention.org. It's available for anyone to look at the resolution as passed, the original resolution, any supporting documents, some of the significant debate that happened around it. That's all available to you in your spare time. But if you do decide to go through that list, you'll notice that there's a lot of A, B, C, and D, but then it goes all the way to X, skips a bunch in the middle. But the X is voting on elections, things like that. But the coding has to do with who suggested the resolution. And then numerically, 1 through however long it takes, based on when they were submitted. Yeah. Anything else about General Convention? Great. Good to be with y'all. Next week, Lambeth.